The first question I would ask would be, what's the state of publishing right now? What are the biggest challenges the publishing world is facing right now from your perspective?
I mean, I think it's a time of real opportunity in the publishing industry, and the economic environment or the industrial environment we operate in for the last 2 or 3 years has been really constructive. So I'm not sure that there's any immediate overhang issues that I think pose an existential threat to the industry. But I think thematically, sort of 3 responses to that would be, and if you go back to the origins of the music industry, at the beginning it was really all about the composer, and the performer was really not an economic factor in the equation. And over the course of the past 50, 60 years, there's sort of been an inversion through the evolution of the industry to a place where both the performer and the composer, are considered an important part of the equation. But I think it's really incumbent upon us collectively to continue trying to bring home to the consumer and really drive the connection with the consumer about who the composer is and what the value is that the composer is bringing to the equation, doing everything we can to promote consumer awareness of who the composer is, not just the performer. There was an article in a periodical yesterday, I think, calling out the fact that there's been a lot of press attention recently about the money that the labels have received or have been monetizing coming out of the Spotify IPO, and that nothing was ever given to the publishers. And that's really just one manifestation of this dynamic that I think, again, is a longer term challenge that we face, but it's a fight worth fighting. The second thing I would say is that collectively we license our music to a lot of wonderful and interesting dynamic companies, but they collectively are extremely powerful. And it's ironic to me that songwriters, who we all ultimately represent, it's a very challenging profession, but ironically it's one of the most regulated industries in the United States, and it's really an unusual situation where you see a regulatory dynamic in the United States that's actually even worse than it is in Europe, and that has historically been the case in the United States. And I think we are very committed to doing what we can to try and address that in little ways. I think the NMPA does a wonderful job of sort of calling out those sorts of issues. We actually collaborate with them along with Global on a project called the Songwriter Freedom Project, which is really meant to seed thought projects that talk about this issue of regulatory burden on composers and music publishers. I think MMA is a step in the right direction. I think Amelia did a great job earlier sort of articulating the different dimensions of how that legislation is likely to move the industry in a positive direction. But I think we have to collectively constantly be vigilant about attempts to impose additional regulatory burdens under the guise of ease of use, complexity, et cetera, et cetera. There really are no problems that ultimately can't be addressed, and I don't think that the default answer should always be further regulation or statutory pricing imposed on music publishers. And then the third answer is really more, I think, germane to this audience. The industry is in the midst of a huge transition that's driven by technology both at the consumption end, but also technology in terms of the ability to track performances, data, understand where those performances are occurring, and make sure that one's getting compensated appropriately. There are significant costs associated with creating the technology platforms and keeping them current that are required to sort of be at the vanguard of where the industry is going. And for an independent publisher as opposed to a major publisher, being sufficiently well educated to make informed choices and making sure that you have a path to accessing those tools day to day, I think is going to be of real existential importance just to remain competitive in the marketplace on an ongoing basis. So that would be sort of, from where I sit, sort of 3 thematic responses to that question.
Okay, that's interesting. It's also interesting that an administration that is taking regulations out of so many other more volatile and dangerous businesses is leaving them intact for songwriters.
Yeah, although it's not apparent to me, and I think we'll all learn a little bit more tomorrow. I think that the Justice Department certainly seems to be inclined to get out of the business of post-transaction behavior regulation. I think some of that may be just an effort to create intellectually consistent behavior to defend their position in the Time Warner litigation. But my guess is that they're more inclined than the prior administration to lift regulatory burdens, or certainly the consent decrees. And, as Kelly said when she was here, my colleague Kelly said earlier, we're an advocate for less regulation in any form, and would certainly support that.
Just to go back to something you mentioned earlier, what are some ways some successful ways you've found of publicly putting a spotlight on songwriters? Because, you see a lot of publishers and a lot of other PROs making attempts at doing it, making game attempts at it. But as a writer, I'm often fascinated, as a reporter, I'm often fascinated to find out how many different songs certain writers worked on and all that. And, you get credits on YouTube and credits on Spotify now and all that. What are some successful ways that you feel you've helped bring attention to individual songwriters who might not get the same light as a performer?
I think that our business, I would answer that too, is I think we're rolling out, I think this week, a complete reboot of our presence, our online presence. And a big part of what's motivated that is a desire to find different ways to feature and showcase the work of our affiliated writers. And we're hopeful, again, that's a small step, but we're hopeful that that's something that will be ultimately successful in helping them build their franchise. We have a team of professionals who are working diligently all the time to try and find opportunities to get work for our writers. And, I think for an organization like ours, we're a little bit different than ASCAP and BMI in the sense that, a disproportionate portion of our repertory is really reflected by artists, legacy artists with long-established careers, for whom those challenges are very different than emerging artists. And so, I would say, our efforts in that regard probably don't match those of ASCAP and BMI. But, as I said before, we're sort of in the process of trying to figure out what we can do to take a much more proactive approach to promoting the work of our writers.
Okay. Just to change tack for a second, do you feel that Sony ATV's purchase of the remainder of EMI, do you think that's going to change the landscape? Do you see anything really becoming different because of that?
From where we sit, from an industrial standpoint, I don't think it's going to make an enormous difference. I think it just makes permanent something that's been a de facto situation in the industry for the past 5 years. I think, there were unique factors that make it, in my judgment, I think it wasn't an existential issue for Sony ATV, but I think the downstream implications of not getting that deal done go beyond whether or not the EMI deal itself was a good transaction on the merits of the price they're paying for it. I think if you took EMI out of the picture, the corpus of what's left with Sony ATV, it just wouldn't be, it's not like it's the reverse analogy of synergistic mergers where 1 + 1 = 3. If you took one piece out of that, I think it would be, a real issue for them competitively. And so I think they were smart to be aggressive and proactive in moving forward with the deal. And obviously it's a unique portfolio of works and, irreplaceable. So I don't see that changing the dynamic per se. There's likely to be some regulatory friction around getting it approved, but my expectation is that'll ultimately be worked out. And I think it just sort of, as I said before, makes permanent something that's been, a de facto situation in the industry for the past 5 years.
No, I think you're right. You've used the word existential a couple of times, and I keep thinking of Sartre. What context do you mean it in here?
Yeah, I mean, for us, I guess, I think like any entrepreneur and probably like many of you in the room, I'm always lying awake at night worrying about the things that can happen, that you can wake up and that have a dramatic impact, adverse impact on your business. We're very focused on doing the things we can do every day to drive the performance and growth of our company. Those are, it takes a lot of foresight and planning to make those happen. But once you set them in motion, if they're managed appropriately, the upside will sort of take care of itself. Mm-hmm. But I always like to think about what could happen that could just dramatically change the landscape in the industry that would put us in a very difficult situation. Mm. So when I'm just talking about threats that really, ones that question the viability of a business as opposed to ones that you just have to do extra work to solve around.
Right, okay. I suppose the last sort of introductory general question is, for investors, is now a good time to invest in publishing, or are we in a bubble?
You know, we're certainly in a very effusive environment. You know, the question, I guess, ultimately is whether the prices, you know, the strength of the environment and its future prospects justify the prices people are paying today. To me, I break it down in three ways. It's a question of valuation, it's a question of interest rates, and it's a question of what the underlying growth dynamic is for the business overall. Without question, you know, prices today reflect some fairly constructive assumptions about the future growth in the industry. I think a lot of that is warranted, but you can argue when you're sort of getting into excessive optimism. To me, it seems clear that interest rates are likely to be going up for a reasonably prolonged period of time, barring some significant economic dislocation. So, you know, I think this is a time based on valuations that we see in the marketplace just to be cautious. And, you know, to the extent that one can avail oneself of a unique opportunity to monetize because somebody's out there for whom your portfolio has just unique value, it's probably not a foolish time to avail yourself. But you know, beyond that, I'm not sure you can really speak constructively in total generalities because it's very idiosyncratic across different assets.
Right. Looking at SESAC a bit more specifically, you know, the company's pretty unique in the United States. You've got the larger PROs, ASCAP and BMI over here. You've got GMR over there, and I think you're somewhere in between the two. How do you differentiate yourself, and what are the assets you point to when, you know, you're talking to writers and trying to get them to bring their catalogs there?
Well, I mean, they're fairly basic points of differentiation. I think everyone in the room is reasonably well aware of them, but at the risk of putting you all to sleep, you know, first and foremost, as you said, we are, and I'm speaking now specifically of our domestic PRO. We have two other businesses, and we think more and more about our business holistically. But just speaking of SESAC PRO, you know, the way I describe it is we sort of take a merchant approach to our domestic business. We view our songwriter affiliates as our partners. The reason why anybody would ever come to SESAC is to make more money. You know, I don't think they come for, you know, in the first instance, beyond perhaps you know, we're a selective membership organization. We think that gives us some degree, you know, we're managing a smaller base of writers and publishers. We think that both gives us the opportunity but also the obligation to be more responsive. So I think people are coming first and foremost to make more money, and secondarily, you know, over time, hopefully to get a level of service that's maybe we have the opportunity to be a little bit more tailored and responsive. But going back to this merchant model, you know, we guarantee people, generally speaking, the opportunity to make more. If we bet incorrectly in that guarantee, we lose money. And if we are successful, then we make money alongside of our writers. It's a big philosophical, you know, point of difference between us and certainly ASCAP and BMI. You know, there is a wide range of people's views on that, and I certainly respect all of them. But for us, the writers that are affiliated with us, the opportunity, you know, to make, you know, to maximize their earnings is really the number one factor that they consider in their choice of PRO. So those would be, you know, the principal points of differentiation. Obviously, Kelly, my colleague, said earlier today, we don't operate under a consent decree, so we think that enables us over time to achieve licensing outcomes that are closer to fair market value. But having said that, we think the consent decrees are a burden for the entire industry, and we've tried to be constructive and supportive in the past of both ASCAP and BMI in their efforts with the Justice Department to get them relaxed or eliminated, and we would continue to do so, just as we would try to be as constructive and helpful and supportive as we can to BMI and their ongoing rate proceeding with the radio industry, because we think a rising tide lifts all boats.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You said, you know, you spoke of your selective policy when it comes to your repertoire. What is the strategy behind that? I mean, are there certain types of artists and catalogs and writers you're looking for?
Yes. I mean, everything for us is a tactical or strategic decision. We are generally looking, in most cases, for established artists where we have some forward ability to really understand what the licensing impact could be from adding them to our repertory base. And it varies. You know, some artists we think have the opportunity to drive, for example, radio or a specific radio licensing negotiation. We do a lot of work, did do a lot of work. A big part of our business actually is in audiovisual music. Actually, I'd say at this point it's probably half our business. And we had a rate proceeding. We ended up settling with the Television Music License Committee a couple of years ago. But in the 18 months before that, we made a very focused decision on what we thought the shows were that could drive that license negotiation. We went out and tried to affiliate, you know, that we made a hit list and prioritized it, and really, you know, very aggressively went out to try and affiliate the writers or publishers who controlled those compositions in an effort to drive that license negotiation. So it's really ultimately about licensing value. It, you know, varies depending on the timing of when we have a big negotiation coming up, but I would say the sorts of artists and compositions that drive value in radio aren't necessarily the same ones that drive value, for example, on Spotify, and so you have to think very tactically and strategically about, you know, where you think you can drive. And frankly, it's incumbent upon us to do that because our whole value proposition, as I said before, rests upon being able to deliver higher value, and we can only do that sustainably if we really make good judgments about how we can drive better licensing outcomes by licensing specific works.
Well, you mentioned film and television. What are some other very strong growth areas you've seen in the last 5 years?
I mean, for us, we don't really look at it based on genres of music. We look at it at end markets, and obviously digital across the board, particularly in audio-based music, which is, as opposed to audiovisual music, has been a huge driver of growth. And, you know, as I said before, we're very tactical in thinking about what works on the digital platforms or what has the ability to drive relatively more value on the digital platforms versus, you know, traditional broadcast. But for us, you know, audiovisual music has been a huge growth area in the last 5 years. We think there are, you know, significant opportunities for us in the future there as well, both in terms of growing our share in that market and also opportunities to be, you know, more effective in monetizing some of the larger platforms in the world where, you know, for a variety of reasons, principally because just the difficulty in identifying tracking performances of audiovisual music, it's a much more challenging exercise than is the case with audio-based business. So we see that as a real area of focus going forward.
Have you seen a spike in things like, you know, Spotify mood playlists and things like that, you know, sleep music or things like that, genres where there hadn't been as much activity before?
I mean, it's definitely a phenomenon. It's really, again, probably less pertinent for us than it would be for our larger competitors, just because our repertory is much more focused on established seasoned catalog as opposed to currently composed works. Not always, but generally speaking.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm sorry. What is this question that was sent over about the global marketplace? Global marketplace.
I mean, I think one of the fundamental changes in our business that's taken place since I joined the company about 4 years ago, we sort of took a step back over the course of a summer to think about some of these existential issues and where the world was going. One thing that's obviously very clear is that the major digital platforms, they think about their business on a global basis, and in a perfect world, they would have one license negotiation, both for the sound recording as well as the composition on a global basis. And we were working at the time actually with a consultant named David King, who's the individual who helped put together the Content ID platform at Google. He had taken a sabbatical or left for a while and was working as a consultant to a business called Rumblefish that we bought. And he had this vision of building something, you know, comparable to the global rights database. And we thought the long-term objective made a lot of sense, but we wanted to approach the problem in a way that was incremental so that you could actually be building the business profitably over time as opposed to investing an enormous amount of money and not knowing until 5 or 10 years hence whether it was actually going to work. But it became evident to us through that exercise that we wanted to begin thinking about our business much more in a multi-territorial way. And, you know, ultimately our vision of where we want to take our company is to be in a position where we can get as close to end-to-end licensing on a global basis. So we'd like to be the first person to touch the money in every market that we license our works on a global basis. There are certain territories and regions where that's going to take longer, practically speaking, than others. But, you know, we've completed the first step of that by, you know, we focused where the money is, and the next biggest bucket of money after the United States is in Europe, and so we formed this joint venture with the Swiss Collective Management Organization to form a joint venture called MINT that's doing pan-European digital licensing. We're beginning to wrap licenses for additional territories in the Middle East and Africa into those licenses, and ultimately we'll bring Asian territories into those as well, and that will really be the launch pad for us to really be thinking about licensing works truly on a global basis.
Do you think a global database is realistic? You know, I mean, I've met with Benji Rogers and Bill Wilson, and they get this missionary zeal about using blockchain to create that database. Do you think that's attainable in the next 10 years?
I think they're two separate issues. I think blockchain is a separate issue. Is it possible to create a single global registry? It certainly is possible. You know, is it in the collective interests of the different parties that have, you know, that, you know, are on the landscape in various geographic territories? You know, it varies, but, you know, I suspect we're moving to an environment in the future where you're going to see much greater transparency, much greater centralization of the data. You know, we may end up with one global. I think that's less likely than regional hubs that have data, and there'll probably ultimately be a fair amount of exchange between those regional hubs for consistency's sake, and also just in terms of efficiency, it's going to be a lot more efficient to share information. Blockchain, I think, is a separate, you know, I think anybody in the room, ourselves first and foremost, would be doing themselves a disservice not to be focusing and, you know, really trying to educate oneself to the greatest degree possible on blockchain. But, you know, for our industry, you know, blockchain as a technology rests upon a foundation block that's undisputed about who owns something. And we're in an industry, you know, where in some instances you don't know who owns it until after it's actually been released in the market. And even at that point in time, there often are disputes about who owns what. So you need to solve that problem. There's also a behavioral issue in our industry where people, you know, for a variety of reasons are accustomed, and in a lot of cases we've seen, I've certainly seen, trying to convince people not to take advance money today on a guaranteed basis as opposed to getting a larger percentage payout over time. Very, you know, difficult to have that discussion with a lot of people in the industry. So people would have to, you'd have to address those two problems, you know, all of which is a long way of saying I think ultimately blockchain is going to be an important technology for any transactionally based business. But my guess would be that music is likely to be not the first industry that gets fully penetrated. So you need to stay on top of it, but a lot of the things that have been announced so far are, I think, more thought experiments than sort of practical approaches to converting the entire industry.
I think that's a fair point. All right, that's about half an hour. Questions? There's a lot of people in this room a lot smarter than me, so fire away.
Or don't.
Or don't.
We would. I mean, that would certainly be our plan.
But since you have HFA, and one of the problems that the industry has was that HFA was not, you know, the most efficient in that regard. Do you think you'll be able to win that tender?
Well, I mean, when we bought HFA, HFA had assets and liabilities. The assets were the data resource, which was, if not, you know, for mine, we looked at a large number of prospective data acquisitions at the time that we bought HFA. If it's wasn't at the time the largest, it was certainly one of the 2 or 3 largest in the world. And then the second thing that it had that was a great legacy asset is commercial connectivity with a very large number of both large and small publishers. The negative were obviously the legacy issues, reputational issues, and performance issues. Quite frankly, a lot of those were attributable to significant underinvestment over a long period of time by the prior ownership regime. Since we've bought the business, I'd say we've invested as much money, if not more, than we paid for the business. You know, we're now clearing, we've actually onboarded one very significant additional DSP that we're doing digital administration for here in the States, so that between our 2 largest customers, we certainly represent more than 50% of the industry. And I think if you talk to them. The rate at which we're clearing in the United States right now, based on what I saw last week, is comparable to best practices you'd see certainly anywhere in Europe. So I think, to answer your question directly, that's going to be one of the challenges that we have to overcome if we bid for that business. But I do think you have to look at those issues contextually in terms of the history of the asset and also what we've done with it since we bought it.
Okay, I saw another hand over there. Please.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Hello, hello. Yeah,
That's good.
I'm going to dodge out of the way here. I'm wondering why you did the deal with Suiza as opposed to any other like European PRO you may have spoken to.
Well, after we acquired HFA, we went on a similar process of, discovery in Europe. We actually spent a lot of time talking to ICE about possibly using them as a back office and having a front office platform run off that. Ultimately, it became clear to us that GAMA was not interested in moving forward, that I think PRS was probably on the fence, but it was clear that that was going to take many, many years. We ended up bringing on a gentleman named Alexander Wolf to run our international operations, who'd been intimately involved in the drafting of the Pan-European directive that created this opportunity, and also the inception and building of Solar, which was really the genesis of ICE. And he had an established relationship with Suiza. Suiza, if you go into the market in Europe, has a very good reputation amongst the smaller societies for technology and quality of data. They've been a fantastic partner. They're, notwithstanding the fact that they're a nonprofit, they're very business-oriented and very responsive, perhaps because they are small. We don't have, we're able to make decisions relatively quickly. So we thought that they would be an ideal partner, and we felt very, very strongly, and I think that's really, that decision was a good one in retrospect, given what we've seen since we launched the platform. We felt that it was important to have a local European partner in building that business.
Okay, I think I saw, yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean, he's basically involved in an ongoing basis in negotiations with each of the DSPs in Europe and is negotiating the rates. The data comes from a combination from HFA as well as Suiza. The challenge is you need a large body of composition data tied to sound recordings, and then you also need to know the rights picture across each individual territory in Europe. That's an area where Suiza, which is already doing pan-European digital licensing for their own repertory, has real, value add.
Cool. Others?
I'm dying up here.
Yeah.
I really apologize. You talk about diversity? I mean, I think diversity, first and foremost, I'd speak for our company, and then I'll speak for what we're doing within the community. One of the best compliments I think I've ever gotten from Kelly Turner, who's my colleague, was the first person I brought in to the company. She was on a panel oriented, I'm not sure exactly where, but it was women in music. And I think the comment she made was that we don't even think about those issues in our company because we just think about people. If you look at our senior management team today, I think it's about 50% female. If not, it's very close. Frankly, we just focus on getting the best person for each job that we have to fill. We've been very, very fortunate in getting some really talented men and women in the company, and I think over time, if that's the approach, logic would dictate that you're going to end up with something close to a 50-50 skew. In terms of diversity within the industry, we actually just made an announcement. We had our Film and Television Awards last week. We have an affiliate named Chris Beck, who's a leading composer for film, who's very committed to diversity, and we endowed basically $1 million fund that's going to be utilized over the course of the next 4 or 5 years to provide workshops and specific opportunities to really get women as well as other underrepresented constituencies in the industry opportunities to get work. So I think it's just a practical process of really working day in and day away to, find opportunities to just do. I think all these things start behaviorally at the company and step by step. It's just a question of doing everything you can every day.
Okay, Ms. Owen? Yes, sir.
Well, I love, it's hard actually. But I mean, when I was younger, I was a huge electronic music fan, so I'm a big Brian Eno fan going back to the early to mid 80s. And also Philip Glass, so that's not pure electronic. But as I've ripened, I'm a big country fan. I love Johnny Cash. Actually, to be frank with you, one of the great things, I have 3 children. I have a 16-year-old girl and 2 14-year-olds, and I just discover a lot of great contemporary music in all genres through listening to what they're listening to. I think, my eldest daughter was big discussion on her house when Childish Gambino's video was released, and I actually, went on YouTube and actually, was able to find, and I think this is very common, obviously it's no great insight, many videos trying to decode the meaning of different elements of it. But I mean, I think that's a fabulous, really relevant piece of work in a genre that I would have never discovered had it not been for the fact that I was living in the house with a 16-year-old girl. So you can find great music everywhere. So that's maybe a non-answer, but the best answer I can come up with.
Hi, John. Can you give me a sense as to how SESAC is responding to the sort of proliferation of new PROs that are not done by the consent decree, such as GMR and AMR, and how are you adjusting your strategy to how
Yeah.
you
I would say as far as GMR is concerned, there have probably been 2, maybe 3 instances I can think of in the last 4 years where we've come up against them on something that we really wanted to go after. And in one case, we ended up signing a deal, and in one case, they ended up signing a deal. In the more recent past, it really hasn't, say to be frank with you, it's almost I see them bringing value into the market in the sense that it's another party that's out there licensing on an unregulated basis. They obviously have gotten involved in a dispute, as we did, with the radio industry, but I think there's an opportunity for them to actually achieve a result that could be beneficial not just to themselves, but for the industry as a whole, and I think that's actually a positive. As I mentioned before, we collaborate with the NMPA on the Songwriter Freedom Project, so I actually see more areas specifically to global of alignment than I do, sort of them having a day-to-day negative competitive impact on our business. The thing that I would worry most about is the concept of fragmentation and the degree to which end users use that as a rationale to argue for regulation. Again, I think it's a specious argument given the actual practical number of entities that one needs to license from. But I think that's something that certainly we think about that's a potential source of concern. The other smaller ones that you mentioned, we really haven't seen any impact from them at all. So I couldn't give you a meaningful answer to it.
Okay, other questions? Please.
Same question asked earlier. What's your end game? You're supported by investors, and the investors at some point want to see their money back. How long before that happens?
Sure. So actually, interestingly, we weren't looking to sell the company when Blackstone bought it. We were engaged in a separate discussion about doing a financing transaction with our former control shareholder, and one of the intermediaries we were working with made Blackstone aware of our company. We weren't particularly interested for the first 2 or 3 months that they were trying to engage us in discussions and doing a deal with them. But what was unique about them, and it's proven actually to be very meaningful in the way we work with them, we were the first investment that Blackstone made in a new vehicle called Core Equity. Core Equity is designed to hold very durable, high-quality business franchises for periods of at least 15 to 20 years, possibly as long as 25 or 30 years. And the end game, you know, because it's sort of we're writing history as we go, may ultimately be to distribute the company's equity to those shareholders. It's a small number of ultra long-term investors who back that fund who would potentially be interested in owning the business. So we don't actually ever think about selling the business anymore. And, you know, we have a mechanism set in place with Blackstone where every 5 years we effectively recapitalize the company, and there's a series of, you know, transactions coming out of that that, you know, compensate the management team to the extent that there's been an increase in the value of the business, but none of that is predicated on a change in ownership. So I fully expect that over the lifetime of my remaining career at SESAC, there won't be any change of ownership, and it could quite well be the case that there's no change of ownership for 25 or 30 years.
Okay, who else? Go for it.
For a young artist, what is, like, what would draw me to CSAC over trying to go to another?
I mean, I think if I were a young artist, the principal issues I'd be focused on is a community. So what is the community immediately of other writers and performers that you're working with? To be really frank, you know, I've seen over the course of my time at SESAC, there are certain communities that gravitate more towards one PRO than others. And for some, and it makes perfect sense, if you really want to be with a group of people, all of whom are affiliated with another PRO, then it may well make sense for you to go and do that, particularly in the early stages of your career. I think that, you know, the themes that we would hit on are just the two that I mentioned before. One is the concept that we're a smaller enterprise, and again, that's no disrespect intended to either ASCAP or BMI. Just means that you know, our hope, our aspiration is that we can be somewhat more responsive, focus a little bit more on the customer that way, and ultimately, you know, that we're able to achieve better licensing outcomes. So, sure.
Follow-up.
So, just coming back to Mint again.
Sure.
What would you recommend that ASCAP and BMI brought to, European licensing?
Well, I mean, I know, again, I don't want to be rude if there are people from both organizations here, and, you know, they could certainly, but I mean, I can tell you that we're engaged in discussions with at least one of them, hopefully two of them over time, about having them join Mint, and we would encourage them to do that. I think there's only benefit to doing direct licensing in Europe outside the regime of the existing reciprocal agreements with the incumbent PROs. There's also the opportunity to do that, obviously, with ICE. But I think they're both studying that. You know, we would be very much hopeful of establishing a collaborative relationship and having one or both of them join us. And, you know, we've expressed to both organizations the fact that we would be desirous of that and very flexible in trying to think about how to make it interesting for them. But there's no question that taking that step, I think, would serve their affiliates well, regardless of whether it's with Mint. You know, I think, you know, we'd be motivated to try and make something happen, so I'm open to a discussion on, you know, I'm inclined to try and make it interesting, whatever we need to do. But I couldn't answer that question specifically until I'm having a discussion.
Anybody else? All
Sure.
right.
You're saving me, so I love you. Mm-hmm. No, I don't think so. You know, first of all, if you talk about I parse that out into licensing and administration. On the administration side, we're already doing digital administration for basically, we have the catalogs of every single industry participant through what we do domestically in the US for our major clients. So it really doesn't require, it's not an issue of the size of the data asset. And when you get into the specific licensing negotiations, it's really just a question of market share, and that's something that you can readily determine using, the tools that are available. So it doesn't really complicate it at all.
Okay, and there's a question all the way in the back.
I think like everyone else in the room, we stand to benefit from a lot of the progressive elements of the legislation. I think we're uniquely positioned perhaps relative to anybody else in the industry in the sense that we have a existing business, which is digital administration, that we're conducting in a free market. That legislation contemplates centralizing that and effectively, taking control of it away from the market and putting it in the hands, in the first instance, of the Library of Congress, but ultimately by this licensing collective. And so we're obviously very focused on just making sure that we have a fair shot to compete for that business. And, to the extent that it's possible, rationalizing the legislation in a way that preserves as much freedom of choice for end users as possible. So I would say, for us more than others, it's a little bit of a mixed bag, or at least it's upside with some potential downside risk. That's the most honest answer I can give you. Say again? I apologize. For us, or with I think the legislation is going to pass. There's friction, there are friction points, but from the conversations I've had both with the RIAA and the NMPA, I think ultimately it gets done. I think for us, it's just a question of, what role, if any, there is for us on a go-forward basis, and we're certainly going to be working very hard to make sure that there is an ongoing role for our business. I mean, the alternatives, there are two existing participants in the market. There's us and MRI, and then obviously I would expect Sound Exchange to be competing for that business as well. And there might be others. There might be SOCAN making an attempt. You need to talk to each of them individually.
Well, that alarm was a subtle reminder that our time is up. So
Thank
thank
you
you,
all.
everybody, and thank you, John.